My name is Evan Hong, and it is a privilege to introduce to you Dr. Anthony Bradley. Dr. Bradley is known on Pacifica's campus as a professor who has transformational impact in the lives of his students. We know this to be true in large part because of the tremendous effort he is having in the lives of Pacifica alumni Titus Ward and his older brother Zeke. Zeke shared with us, Dr. Anthony Bradley is one of the most influential forces that has shaped my Christian faith since I moved to New York City. Through his classes at the King's College, I learned the foundations of Christianity and society, as well as the importance of my faith in the face of my political ideology. His lectures on historical theology radically challenge how I view my faith in the context of the historical church, and his passion for equipping the next generation to engage with scripture and culture was always an encouragement. I've traveled to Israel on a trip co-led by Dr. Bradley, and I've also gotten lunch with him on Wall Street. He is a brilliant mind, but also, and more importantly, a good man. Titus said of Dr. Bradley, both in the classroom and across the dinner table, Dr. Bradley has poured into my life in more ways than I can count. His teachings on Christ, society, and how people can be effective humans has given me wisdom that I hope to give my children someday. Any chance I get to spend time with Dr. Bradley, I consider an incredibly valuable opportunity. As a school that cares deeply for the lives of young people and seeks a relational approach to our formation, we thank you, Dr. Bradley, for your sacrifice and commitment to your students. We are confident your generosity of spirit and love of others is of eternal significance. More formally, Dr. Anthony Bradley is a professor of religious studies and the director of the Center for the Study of Human Flourishing at the King's College. Dr. Bradley is also a research fellow at the Acton Institute. Dr. Bradley lectures at colleges, universities, business organizations, conferences, and churches throughout the U.S. and abroad. His writings on religious and cultural issues have been published in a variety of journals, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Examiner, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, the Detroit News, Christianity Today, and World Magazine. Dr. Bradley is called upon by members of the broadcast media for comment on current issues and has appeared on C-SPAN, NPR, CNN Headline News, and Fox News, among others. He studies and writes on issues of race in America, mass incarceration, overcriminalization, youth and family, welfare, education, and ethics. Please join me in welcoming to the podium our final speaker, Dr. Anthony Bradley.
Thanks for that introduction. I am delighted to be here. I want to begin this session. We're talking about fatherhood today. And I want to begin by making an extremely controversial statement. And it is simply this, that fathers are the most important men in any community, anywhere, period. Fathers are the most important men in any community, anywhere, period. There's a gentleman by the name of Jason Wilson, and he runs a martial arts school in the Detroit area, works with a lot of low-income young men. He was telling a story recently, actually this morning I said I'm going to tell the story. His teenage son, was having surgery, and his surgery, as he was coming out of anesthesia, he was screaming in the room, and so the nurse runs out and gets his mother, who is a registered nurse, said, "Hey, can you come back and comfort your son because he's screaming as he's coming out of anesthesia?" And as the father, he said, I got kind of offended, that they came and asked the mother to come back, and so she did go back, because she is a nurse, and a few minutes went by, and the kid's still screaming as he's coming out of anesthesia. So he said, I walked up to the nurse's desk, and he says, "I need to go back and see my son." And she says, "Well, no, you understand. I need to go back and see my son." So he walked back to the son's room, the son's still screaming, and he said he walked in, and he placed his hand on his son's chest. And he said, "Son, it's going to be all right. You're just nervous. This is a new environment. You're going to be fine." And he said his son immediately calmed down. And then he said this. He said, "There's power in the nurturing love of a father. There's power in the nurturing love of a father. And one of the things that makes the "and" so important in a free and virtuous society, I'm going to argue in part today, is the family. The family is the first context in which children learn the intersection of freedom and virtue, and in the family, those are often guided by the father. Now, I won't take up too much time because there's a whole theology of this that I could rant about for quite some time. But I simply want to encourage dads to understand how absolutely vital you are. And I want to encourage those of you who are going to be future dads that we will not have a society unless you are able to exercise your vocation as a father, and to do that with excellence and also a lot of fun. I want to clarify just a few terms as I talk about this topic today. We often, I think, conflate some terms and misunderstand some realities. Fatherlessness is a problem. We often think about that with the assumption that it means that a father is not present. We often talk about it in relationship, especially in the African American community, that about 70% of black kids are born outside of marriage, but that doesn't mean they're fatherless. It just means the mother's not married to the dad. Now, what the data also shows, which is really fascinating, is that black fathers on average spend more time with their kids than white fathers do. But it's outside of the institution of marriage. I'll give you a great example of this. I've been doing a lot of work in Harlem for the last 10 years. And I was having a conversation with one of the members of this church. This young man's probably in his mid-20s. He is a brand new father of twins, living with the mother outside the context of marriage. Now, technically, that would be a children born outside of wedlock, but that doesn't mean the fathers aren't present. He lives there, and I asked him, hey, why don't you just get married? I'm on him all the time, bro. Get married. In fact, I told him I'll do it for free, right? We'll do it in the park. We will, in the subway station. We'll do it in a Five Guys. I will marry you guys anywhere for free. And he says, well, if we get married, we'll lose all of our benefits. Right? He works in a retail store. The mother of his children also works in a minimum wage job, and he said that she gets a lot of benefits from the city of New York by being below a certain income, and if we get married, we'll lose all the benefits, and then we'll have to move out of the apartment, which is also subsidized, and they can't afford to live in Manhattan otherwise. And so there are disincentives for them to actually get married. He would love to get married. She would too. But those children are not fatherless. There's just not a marriage context there. So just because a kid's born outside of wedlock does not mean the father is not present. You also want to introduce this term dad deprived and father absence. Now, dad deprivation simply means this, and a few of you will be able to relate to this. It's a father who may be present, but actually is not fathering. That is, he's in the home, he may be physically present, maybe financially present, but he's not actually fathering the children. That is a specific vocation, and it's a calling. That's an activity, fathering. So there are lots of children who grow up in homes that are still dad deprived. So there's a difference between a father who's involved and a father who is uninvolved. And marriage may or may not be the variable that determines the level of involvement with the father. So what I'm going to talk about today is what happens in the context of dad deprivation and why it is that fathers are so important. One of the things that we have seen specifically in this country is the increase of fatherlessness. If you look at some of the main causes of fatherlessness, two things stand out. One is no-fault divorce, the escalation of divorce, 1-800-DIVORCE, right? If you're having a bad week, get a divorce. And also out-of-wedlock births. If you probably can't see this too clearly in the back. Oh, this is nice. There's no shadow back here? Man, this is fancy. All right, it's really cool. 1970, which was a really great year, although 1971 was an awesome year because that was the year I was born. 1970, great year. What you see in the disparity here is the homes that were mother-only homes is the blue area, and father-only homes is the black area there. And what you'll see is the escalation over that time period there of homes raised by moms. This would be a completely different talk for another day, but this also is going to track with incarceration rates. That's just footnote that. So if you look at the number of children living with a single mother or a single father over this time period, you will see this increase as well. Divorce is also a major problem as it's gotten worse. You see 1940 there at the bottom, 2000 there as well. This massive increase in children who are living in homes without fathers. The children born to married couples, 1964 versus 2010. 1964 being, as I recall, the first year of the Ford Mustang. It was in the summer of 1964. I only know that because I drove a 1964 Ford Mustang in high school. And I was part of the cool kids that had the muscle cars then. So I remember this year, 1964, 93% of the kids in this country were born to married couples. By the time we get to 2010, it's 59%. This has introduced some devastating consequences to our society, both politically, socially, and economically. In fact, if we were to take a field trip over to the closest prison, the closest juvenile detention center, the closest women's prison, for example, there will be one common narrative in almost every single jail cell in those facilities. It is dad deprivation. In fact, I am secretly on a mission to abolish the police through fatherhood. I'm also on a mission to put psychiatrists and psychologists out of business and counselors out of business through fatherhood. Look at some of this data here. This is from a massive 1998 study. By the way, this data pretty much still holds today. Children who come from fatherless homes, dad-deprived homes, 63% of youth suicides come from those homes. 90% of all homeless and runaway youths come from those homes. Children with behavior disorders, 85% come from those homes. Who's drop out of school? The kids that drop out of school come from homes that are dad deprived. Juvenile detention centers, 70% of kids who are in the juvenile system come from fatherless homes. Substance abuse, 75% of adolescent patients in substance abuse programs come from dad-deprived homes. 75% of rapists who are motivated by displaced anger. Actually, I believe that number has gone up to 80% with some recent data, comes from homes where there is real dad deprivation. If you look at some updated data, a violent crime, for every 1% increase in fatherlessness in a community, it predicts a 3% increase in adolescent violence. %80 of those who rape out of anger, as I said earlier, come from fatherless homes. Now, this one's really interesting here. That children learn empathy from their father, not their mother. So this is what we do in the data. The more time a child spends with his or her father, the more empathetic the child will be as an adult. I remember I read that, I came across that data, and I about fell on the floor. Because you think, mom's the compassion one. No, it's actually the father that teaches empathy. And one of the most magical ways in which fathers teach empathy is through roughhousing. Let me go back and give another example of empathy before I talk about roughhousing. So Jason Wilson, again, has this story of caring for his elderly mother. And he noted that his teenage son, watched him care for his mom that had dementia. So he had to wash her hair and clothe her and do her nails. And he said he walked in one day and he noticed that his teenage son, after seeing his mom come home, tired from a long nursing shift, was giving his mom a foot massage. Now, where does he learn that? Well, he said, my son learned this by watching me take care of my mother. And so for him as a teenage son, it was no problem. It was sort of a reflex to care for his own mother when she was having a bad and long day. One of the most powerful things a dad can do, particularly with his children and especially with his sons, is roughhouse. It has this unbelievable way of teaching delayed gratification, self-control, and setting boundaries, and being other-centered. See, when you roughhouse with your son, with your kids learn, oh, I can't put my finger in the eye. Oh, that hurts, Dad. Right? I can't put my knee there. That might hurt. Right? It also has a magical way of teaching delayed gratification. This is how it works. Children want to play with their dads. They do. They really do. In fact, some kids will tempt their dad into playing, right? They'll walk over and poke him, right? What will they say? I bet you can't catch me, right? Or they'll nudge him and be like, oh, I guess we're going to wrestle now, right? They love it. They absolutely love it. So when the dad says, hey, we can roughhouse after you clean your room and do your homework and help your mother out. See, that's where the empathy comes in, because the father's often the person who enforces the empathetic rules to care for the other person. Especially with boys, they know how to work their moms. Daughters know how to work their dads. But dads are often the enforcer of the rules. They say, no, you have to care about your mother and your sister. Don't do that. But after you do all these things, we will roughhouse later. The kid's like, okay, great. Homework done. Let's go. It also teaches about these boundaries. And what's really interesting, of course, that what the data shows, and there's hard data on this, is that especially for boys, the more they roughhouse with their dads, the less likely they are to struggle with porn addictions and video game addictions. It's like magic. And I'm like, dads, this is not hard. You can do this. And it's especially important during the teen years as well. In fact, I tell dads, don't ever stop roughhousing with a guy. 30 years old, he walks in, tackle him immediately. Right? Now, I was on the subway in New York, and I saw this really beautiful moment where a dad was roughhousing with his son on the subway, and I wanted to take my phone out and record it and put it on Instagram, but I said, I shouldn't do that. So they're roughhousing, poking and wrestling there right on the subway, and I'm thinking, this is amazing. I'm like taking notes. I'm like, I got to use this for a talk later. And what was so magical about this experience is that when it slowed down, the son rested his head on his father. And they had a few moments looking in each other's eyes and smiling and laughing and having really deep connection. And this kid was probably 10 or 11 years old. Now, what does that do? What does that do? When this kid's 17, 18 and has a problem, he knows he can go to his dad. When he's struggling, he can go to his dad. Because they have this connection now that's built both on fun and enjoyment, but also connection. One of the things that really this sets kids' lives on fire for the good is when they realize and understand that their parents don't just love them, that they enjoy being around them. And when a child knows that his father enjoys him or her, it really sets him up for an unbelievable amount of success. So if there's one thing, dads, that I would say, leave you here with, or one thing, future dads, there's one thing from this entire session I would say, roughhouse with your kids every day and just watch what happens. I've been talking about this for years. I get emails all the time where dads will say, you know what, we didn't used to do that. My son's 15. He came home. I just tackled him, and it changed our relationship. Right? Because there's, and I'll move on from this, one last point. There's something that happens. When a father starts to poke at and initiate roughhousing with children. What happens to their face? They start smiling. And that's the beginning of really fantastic and important levels of connection. What's really interesting is to think about it economically, that there is a direct correlation between child poverty and fatherlessness and dad deprivation. The red area there represents married couples in terms of children living in poverty from 2001 to 2011. The blue area there is the female-headed household. Now, this is how important dads are, and by extension, this is how important marriage is as well. Please understand that there are some communities in this country where the vision and understanding of marriage has basically died. And one of the things that we have to do is continue to celebrate and invite people, particularly in low-income communities, to get married. Marriage is awesome, we should tell them, and celebrate it, right? All the jokes and all the sitcoms about sort of denigrating marriage, it's not helpful. I was recently talking to a 15-year-old lad in Harlem, and I was telling him, hey, we saw a teenage girl that had a child outside of marriage, and I told him, I said, hey, what you want to do is get married first and then have a child. It's part of the success sequence. And he looked at me with all honesty and said, "Do people do that?" And why did he say that? Because he actually hadn't seen it. It wasn't really part of his default like it would be for communities like us. I mean, David was right. It's interesting that the people that are the most ardent champions of the state serving the role of the father are also the ones who never do it, right? I mean, if you look at the lifestyles of those who are very wealthy on the left, they have extremely conservative lifestyles. Their daughters and sons don't have children outside of marriage. They completely follow the success sequence. So father absence really does matter. I have a series of data slides here from the Fatherhood Initiative. I was going to make my own slides, but they already did it, so I'll just use theirs. Their graphics are better than what I could do anyway. Here are just the hard facts. I'm just going to give you the data here, right? Father absence is to blame for many of our most intractable and social ills affecting children. Now, what's interesting about this particular data set with respect to fathers is that even in the social sciences where you say that correlation is not causation, actually social scientists are beginning to say this actually is causation, not just correlation. That we see these dots being connected with the absence of fathers in terms of the effects on children. Individuals from father-absent homes are 279% more likely to carry guns and deal drugs than peers living with their fathers. Here's what people probably haven't paid attention to over the years, is that almost every single school shooting, almost every single one, that involved a high school boy was a high school boy who was a victim, I'll say victim, of dad deprivation. In fact, it's the first thing I look for. I get the story, I get the name, and I start searching to get the family narrative, and in almost every single case since Columbine, it's a dad deprivation issue. One of the school shootings in the Seattle area, this lad posted right before he went in the next day and shot up his school, "I wish I had a father." 279% more likely to carry drugs and to carry guns and to deal drugs. Adolescent teen boys who live with their dads are less likely to carry guns and deal drugs. It's really fascinating, right? So to think about it this way, that hurt boys hurt others. What we see with a lot of girls is that they will often internalize their pain. So eating disorders, cutting, things like that. But for boys, when they hurt, they go hurt somebody else. And what often keeps that at bay, usually, is the loving presence of a father. We see the data really clearly. A lot of lads grow up in loving homes with their mom, but there's something missing in here. There's a void, and they act that out violently often with others. Involved dads improve children's overall emotional and social well-being. Now, what's so fascinating to me about this, right, is it took a study in the Journal of Famous somebody got a grant, right? Got probably a federal grant to arrive at the conclusion that the presence of a father is fantastic for a child's mental and social well-being. Their mental health is better with the presence of a father. I'm in the wrong business. This is what this means. Adolescent single mother and single father families are at higher risk of risky behaviors, victimization, and mental distress compared to those in two-parent families. I could give an entire separate talk on the role of mothers that would include how it is that the mom's influence on their children, particularly during those first few years, almost determines the development of their child's central nervous system and how they handle anxiety and stress. But that's an entire separate talk for. I'll come back and do that one if you'd like. It's really, really fascinating data. The absence of the biological father contributes to the risk of child maltreatment. So children that don't have the dad in the home, much more vulnerable to abuse. Now, why does this happen? This often happens because the mother will at times bring in the house the boyfriend or the guy that she just met last week or that night, and then that man abuses the children that are not his. If the father's in the house, there is no extra man that come in who abuses the children of the father. Fathers generally protect their children. So when moms bring in the boyfriend, it actually opens up the children to an incredible amount of risk. Children with, again, I can't believe this was a study here in the Journal of Criminal Law and Criminology. Like someone got tenure because of this. That children with imprisoned fathers are more likely to have depression. Now, of course, a child whose father is not present is going to struggle with depression. And in some cases, hopelessness makes them actually more vulnerable to things like suicide. This is how important a father's mere presence, his loving, intentional presence, is with respect to a child. It regulates a child's emotions. Infant death within the first 28 days of life is 4 times higher with those with absent fathers than those with involved fathers. This has a lot to do with the effects of cortisol, stress hormone, and because the circulatory system of the mother and the baby in utero is the same system. What you want to make sure happens is that moms are not stressed. Because if moms are stressed, the baby's stressed. So we have to, this is separate talk, we have to protect the stress levels of pregnant women, period. If her cortisol levels are up, that's in her bloodstream, guess where it's going? So guess what happens? When infants are born in a highly stressed state, it makes them more vulnerable to mortality. I was taking a class at a university that is run by a bunch of Jesuits. I won't name it for them. And I was having this course on health disparities, and it landed on this conclusion that if you look at the health disparities between black women and white women, you see that black women's infant mortality rates are higher because they're more stressed. And they said that, well, the reason that they're more stressed is racism. Like, what? Well, that's got to be the reason. I said, well, actually, and so I raised my hand, because I learned in the context where you're sort of a minority, you don't sort of make declarative statements, you just ask questions. It's really innocent questions, right? So I raised my hand and I said, hey, do these studies control for marriage? And, and one of the Brazilians said, oh, yeah. Basically, that when you introduce marriage, the infant mortality rates are about the same. I said, well, maybe I thought this because I didn't want to, because, I said, well, maybe these mothers are so stressed out because they're alone. And maybe the prospect of raising a child alone increases the level of anxiety and the cortisol levels, and it makes their child in utero vulnerable to a highly stressed state. Maybe stress might be more of a problem, not necessarily racism. And I remember because the response from the professor was, well, we can't expect these women to get married. And I'm like, yes, we can. I'll do it for free. Right? I'll do a whole room. Bring them in this room. I'll just do one big ceremony, right? For better, for worse, for richer, for poor. I'll just do it. I'll sign the whole thing. Because in New York City, by the way, this is an aside, you have to be licensed by the city to perform wedding ceremony. So I had to take all of my degrees and all the stack of paper to the city of New York for them to let me do something that's in the church. That's a separate talk. Daughters are less likely to engage in risky sexual behavior when they have consistent contact and a sense of closeness with their fathers. That phrase, daddy issues, is scientific. And there's some predatory men, young men, even high school boys, because I heard some high school boys talking about this. They told me in a moment of transparency that they actually look for girls from divorce homes because they're easier, right? Because if she's from a divorce home, you need to give her the attention she's not getting from her dad. Tell her she's beautiful, tell her she's lovely, right? A caress here, time spent together, all the love languages, bring her something. She's not getting in it from her dad. And at 15, this guy's like, I can just do that. This is how important dads are, particularly for girls. Dads set the standards and fills the needs for connection and intimacy and love. And you know that, oh man, I'm aging myself here, but looking for love in all the wrong places. You know this phrase? Right? Well, that's what this is. When the dad's absent, often the girls are looking for love in all the wrong places, and then some tool comes in and says, I will be the wrong place. That's what happens. And the data, again, proves this. Education outcomes, children who live with their dads do better in school. Here's a fact. Whatever dads are excited about, kids get excited about. Dads can, think about it, dads can make their children fans of sports teams in schools that kids have never attended. The kid's 6 years old and is a USC fan. Why is that? I mean, actually, well, why is that? So this is what happens. Dad's got USC stuff, the USC room, towels, watch the game. There's a catechism. They do all the cheers. And the kid is like, US, right? But guess what? When dad's excited about math, the kids get excited about math. When dad's excited about learning, the kids get excited about learning. When kids see their dads reading becomes a good and normal thing. So dads have a way of really improving those education outcomes just by their mere presence. Boys have fewer behavioral problems, and girls have fewer psychological problems when they have involved dads. And we talked about juvenile delinquency. Adolescent boys with absent fathers are more likely to engage in delinquency with those versus those who have present fathers. That bears itself out in the juvenile detention data. Children raised from father-absent homes are 2 times more likely to suffer from obesity. This is sensitive, very, very sensitive. So this is what happens, and this is kind of an American problem. We often self-soothe our anxiety and depression with food. That's how we deal with discomfort. We experience discomfort, and then we eat something. And what happens? We get a dopamine release from that, and we feel better. What happens often in children who are in father-absent homes is that there's real anxiety there, there's real depression there, and they often self-soothe that depression with their absent father with a stack of Oreo cookies or an entire bag of processed food chips or something like that. Also happens to be the case in some instances where overworked and stressed out moms don't have a lot of time to cook meals at home and relies on fast food to feed her children, increases the level of obesity. The cycles get introduced. Women with absent fathers are more likely to have children with absent fathers. Becomes normalized as well. Becomes pattern, becomes culturally habituated in that sense. And there's really interesting data about sort of expanding on this, the father's cultural impact. University of Texas study repeats some of the things that we've seen. Kids with involved dads are 39% more likely to earn A's in school, 45% less likely to repeat a grade, 60% less likely to be suspended or expelled from school. When we see the disparity on suspensions, I'm like, well, what's going on at home? I used to teach high school. I used to teach at a Christian school. I taught 9th grade. And whenever there was a behavioral issue, my knee-jerk response was to the kid, what happened at home? 75% less likely to have a teen birth, 80% less likely to spend time in jail. Providing services and programming that aims to increase fathers' positive parenting skills, appropriate discipline, effective communication, emotional support, and stress management can have a double effect, reducing risk factors for child abuse and also increasing protective factors as well. There's a great study that was done by Jeff Rosenberg and Bradford Wilcox. Dr. Wilcox teaches at UVA. He's done a lot of great things there. You can look this study up at your leisure. I just want to end here with thinking about what we can do to help dads, to encourage dads, because we can't have a free and virtuous society unless we have dads who are freely and virtuously living out their vocation with an enormous amount of joy. That's what we need. So fathers need to take an active role in nurturing their children. Fathers need to take a careful look at how they discipline their children. I mean, we all know. For those of you who are 18 and older, maybe 12 and older, you know that sometimes your parents can say something that just pierces your soul. And sometimes those words, those 3 words or those 4 words a parent has the power to say that will send you into therapy for 20 years. You're worthless. You're not important. You're just like your terrible dad. I wish we didn't have you. These are things that kids have told me that their parents have told them. Right? Why can't you be more like your brother? Things like that. In those moments of frustration and tension, what do you say? Be careful there. Number 3, those working with fathers must be on the lookout for a father who finds himself chronically angry, depressed, insecure, powerless, and stressed. Dads need support. Healthy dad, healthy kid, healthy marriage, healthy America, healthy world. It's all great. I'm going to make that case there. Fathers need to tend to their marriage and their romantic relationships. One of the things that I've sort of been pressing against is this idea that the children come first. That often leads to divorce. But marriage comes first. The children live under a context of a strong marriage. There is nothing that makes children feel more safe and secure and stable than their parents who are deeply in love with each other, even if it grosses the kids out. Why are you touching each other so much? This is why divorce is so damaging and devastating to kids. Lastly here, fathers should teach their children to develop respect for their own bodies. There's something magical that happens both with fathers and their sons and their daughters when fathers affirm the physicality of their daughters. You're so beautiful and stunning and gorgeous. To hear that from a dad means something very different and hugely impactful. For the dad to tell a lad, wow, you're getting really strong, but you still can't take me, right, means something as well. So fathers, it's not just that fathers matter, fathers are crucial. And what we have to do as a community is celebrate them and protest these pathetic shows that show dads as losers. And instead demand those shows that show dads as the winners that they are by the mere nature of their presence and their love. And this is why fathers are the most important men in any community, anywhere, ever. Period. Thank you very much. Is there even time for Q&A? There may not be. Okay, all right. That's a study. You can look at it. It's great.
Dr. Bradley, thank you so much.
Welcome.
I had an irresistible urge to kind of do a Terry Tate office linebacker and just kind of come up and start wrestling with you. It'd be a little awkward. We don't know each other, but I look forward to that. Yep. Q&A. We have a few minutes for questions for Dr. Bradley.
You probably have some text or something, you know? Yeah.
So I had great hope around the 2008 election when Obama talked about this issue, and then it just went away. Yeah. And it's only gotten worse in the last few years in terms of attributing everything to racism instead of attributing problems to some of the data that you point to and also just common sense. Yeah. So what is the path to move back to looking at data, looking at the nature of human beings to move forward in this area and build stronger families?
That's a great question. Maybe because I'm a bit of a contrarian, I actually want to invite people to look at the data and let the data speak. Now, what's fascinating right now is that we have this boy crisis, right? You've heard of the boy crisis, right? We have about 9 million prime-age working age men between the age of 24 and 54 who are currently doing nothing. They're not in trades, as people assume. They're not in college doing nothing. Boys trail girls in every subject, in every grade across the country, actually across the West. Right? Massive, massive crisis now. Marriage rates are declining. 61% of all college freshmen this fall were women, right? So the guys are disappearing. So now there's like, uh-oh, what's the problem? I'm actually encouraged because the data is now forcing the conversation. That even people who are moderate and even on the left are having to deal with this data. Like, you can't look at the data and just ignore it. Now, what's also interesting is that their daughters are single because of some of this data. Why can't my 25-year-old daughter who's a lawyer find a husband, right? What's happening? So I'm actually encouraged, sadly, that the data, well, I'm encouraged, I'm discouraged because the data exists, but I'm encouraged because people are now having to wrestle with the data, and it's opening people up to some of these realities. One of my jobs I signed on to is to just present the data and let people sit with the discomfort of the data and say, you explain this, right? But I think it also means we need to know the data so that we can share it with truth and grace and love. Yeah, great question.
All right, we have a question over here.
Hi. First of all, thank you for that introduction. I think that was one of the most powerful introductions to a speech like this that I've ever heard. So fathers is something that I think we can all agree with and that we see as the necessary. But I think as I've aged, I am aging in life, and my kids have gotten older, I have realized that I was raised in a society that was so ingrained, this feminist movement that my parents were, products of and whatever, that I wasn't even cognitively aware of it throughout my whole life, right? And as a Christian, in a Christian home, trying to raise children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, it has been one of the most challenging parts in allowing the fathers to do the father thing. What would you say to women in this sort of, we know the truth, but what practical steps would you say? Can you address the women in that sort of environment?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. So one of the privileges I've had over the years is leading men's groups on this topic, and there's sort of two push and pull realities that needs to happen. On the one hand, some of the women and mothers need to step back and let the fathers actually do some things. But then secondly, the men need to push each other to do the things, right? So it's not just sort of one or the other, it's both happening at the same time. And when I've been in churches where there's a commitment to that, you begin to see the sort of slow growth and the tide turns that way. But what often happens for men in many churches is they get a lot of shame about how inadequate they are as fathers. There's some church communities where Mother's Day is a great day of celebration and Father's Day is the day of lament, right? We've got to bring some equality. We need to bring some DEI to Mother's and Father's Day as well, right? We need to celebrate dads and encourage them, but also let them fail, right? Let them do some things, let them lead. And when they fail, don't shame them or mock them about it as well, right? Now listen, there's some family systems, you just want to get stuff done, right? Stuff's got to get done. You're like, I cannot wait for it. I can't get it done, right? And part of that tension is a sort of rehabituation of how you negotiate, how you're going to manage your family, expectations, and part of those discussions. But because I was raised in a home where my mom would always do stuff, and I remember having conversation with her recently where she said, I've come to realize I just have to let your dad do this. I could do it, but I know that your dad needs to do this. And so she stepped back so that my dad could do some things. And as I said a moment ago, the dads need to continue to coach and push each other, right? Listen, men don't ever not need a coach, period, right? Every boy, every man needs a mentor. It doesn't matter if he's 15 or 45. And if he's 50 years old, I hope he's having regular conversation with someone who's 70 or 80 about his midlife crisis and how to push through that successfully, right? So if men are building into each other, space is created for men to step in and take some leadership, you'll begin to see those times, that tide turn slowly, but it's got to be a community. It's got to be a community activity. I tell churches, listen, men are worth more than folding chairs, doing parking in the soundboard, and serving food. Right? They're worth more than that.
Dr. Bradley, thank you so much for your time.